My name's Brian, recovered alcoholic, and my sobriety date's February 2nd, 1997, and for that I'm truly grateful. You know, it was important to me when I came to AA that they told me uh, to own my sobriety. Own it. Write my name in my book, you know? Write my name in the... Actually, I don't have it written in this book. I got all kinds of other things written in this book. But I could pull some of my big books out from my shelf, and it's got my name and my sobriety date written on it. I own my sobriety date. Own it. Got to have a date. Own the date. I write it in the book, and I write my name in the book, so like ownership. You know what I mean? Uh, is everybody muted? No. Mute. Okay, good. All right. And all right. I'm doing the best I can. All right. So before we open this up, I just wanted to say that I want to open this up with the set aside prayer to help us set aside what we think we know, heck, about everything, about God, meetings, big book, even myself, you know. And so it's just telling me we're just gonna put it aside. We're not gonna forget about it. You know, I always tell people this, when they come back from a relapse. I always say you gotta just forget. You gotta put aside what you think you know so you can have a new experience with this. Because if I was not able to do that, I wouldn't have a new experience and I wouldn't have stayed here. You know, I just gotta put it aside. Whatever it is that I think I know, so I can have an open mind and a new experience. So why don't we just take a 1 minute silent meditation for each one of us to invite the God, higher power, whatever of your own understanding, and also to remember the still sick and suffering alcoholic. And we're going to take the moment of silence and we're going to start it right now. Okay, welcome back. We're going to say the set aside prayer. God, please help me set aside everything I think I know about myself, the 12 steps, the big book, my alcoholism, other conceptions of God, so I may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Please help me see my truth. Amen. Okay, we're going to start on page 44. And I hope that before we even start reading, I was just thinking of, I hope everyone was able to see their insanity that we covered in more about alcoholism with the 3 stories, Jim, Fred, and the man of 30. And I really pointed out the ego in there and our insanity. And we really have to see our insanity in step 1 to go along with the idea of being restored to sanity in step 2. And we're kind of on that threshold between step 1 and step 2. We're getting ready to kind of make that transition from 1 to 2. And so if the problem is powerless, then the solution is going to become empowered by something. So we're going to be on page 44. And the first paragraph is basically just a review. In every chapter, every chapter that's going to start, even in how it works, there's a review. There's even a review in More About Alcoholism, and there's one in there, Solution. So it says in the preceding chapters, the 3 chapters that we read, and then the doctor's opinion, you have learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made a clear distinction between alcoholic and non-alcoholic. Now, it's pretty easy to see if you're an alcoholic by just asking yourself these 2 questions. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely because of the mental obsession. Or if when drinking you have little control, I underline that word control, over the amount you take because of the physical craving, because of the allergy, right? I can't control the amount I take because it sets off the physical craving for me to have more, and I can't stop. And then it says, either one of these, if you honestly want to and you find you cannot quit entirely because of the mental obsession, or when drinking you have little control over the amount you take because of the physical craving, you are probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now, I'm going to tell you, at first, when I first read this, I felt a little bit doomed here because I didn't live any type of spiritual way of life or anything like that, and I wasn't sure if this was even possible for me to have such an experience. But the next paragraph gave me a little hope. It said, to one who feels he is an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. I just wrote, I doubt. That was some of my doubt, that this experience. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially as the alcoholic of the hopeless variety. I want you to underline hopeless, maybe put it in parentheses, hopeless. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. Man, I got to find a spiritual basis of life. That's basically what it's telling me, or I'm going to be doomed. Now, I'm just going to tell you, honestly, I don't really know what that's, I mean, I know what it's about now, but in the beginning when I started, I had no clue what this being spiritual even meant. I thought it meant going to church or something, and I wasn't going to do that, you know. The other thing I want to talk about here is this hopeless variety. We're talking about a hopeless alcoholic. And I want to go all the way back. We touched upon the hopelessness in the doctor's opinion, you know, and I'm just going to throw out some page numbers if you want. You don't need to go there. I'm not going to go there, but I'm just going to give you the page numbers of where this hopelessness was talked about. In doctor's opinion, it was talked twice. It was XXI, which is actually the first page of the doctor's opinion, and again on XXVII, where it didn't say hopeless, it said no hope. And then in Bill's story on page 6, 10, and 12, 6, 10, and 14, and on page 14 is when he's talking about, while he's laying in the hospital, what about those other hopeless alcoholics that might have what I have, which is hope? And then again on page 17, it says nearly all was just as hopeless as Bill. And then we learned in More About Alcoholism last week, that there was 4 times in the last 2 pages, on 42 and 43, it had words like hopelessly, hopeless condition, hopelessness, 100% hopeless. And then again, we just saw it again on We Agnostics, and talking about a hopeless variety. I like to think that when I'm in this hopeless state, that's really where I'm at. I don't have any hope, but I got some hope from here, because it's not easy alternatives to face, but it made it sound like, that I could do this. I already learned about the 2 alternatives and their solution, so I'm already on a path. But it isn't so difficult. About half of the original fellowship are exactly that type. I highlighted that as a promise. It isn't so difficult. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. I think that's funny, hoping against hope that we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact, underline the word fact, that we must, underline the word must, and it's the only must in this whole chapter. And what it says is I must face the fact that I must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Now, I don't know what or else is, but I think it's something similar to doom, to be doomed to an alcoholic death, or accept spiritual a spiritual basis of life. And perhaps it's going to be that way with you. But cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheist or agnostic. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. And I actually highlighted that, underlined that after the comma as a promise. And then before that was a direction. So the direction started. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life, or else. And perhaps it's going to be that way with you. Bottom of the page. If a mere code of morals, I was thinking about this the other day. If a mere code of morals, whatever they may be, or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us. They only sounded good. No matter how much we tried, we could wish to be moral. We could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might. That's everything we got. We can will them all. But the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed us utterly. This is really setting us up for the next chapter. And basically, what it's telling me is that I failed myself. My human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed us utterly. Self-sufficient failed me. Me relying on myself, getting me all the way to this point, to the point where, I got two alternatives. One's to go on to the bitter end, and the other one's to accept spiritual help, But here's the thing. I was thinking about this the other day. My human resources, marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. I failed myself because I created everything. I created this. I thought I had to rely on myself. I didn't know there was any other option, And so I created all kinds of drama, through my ego. It was almost like my ego made me do everything to myself because my problems are of my own making, and I create drama. I look at it like I had created all this stuff in my life, right? All this drama, and like I'm the creator. So if I'm the creator, isn't it? I come into this step, and I'm having a hard time because I've created everything in my life up to this point, and I just made a mess of it. My life's unmanageable, and it's all because of my ego is in the back of driving. The ego is in the back there driving everything, and just making a mess. So I need to find a power that's bigger than my ego. And that's how I'm going to approach this, because self-reliance failed me because of my ego. I need to find a power that's bigger than my ego. And your unmanageability prevents you from finding this power on your own. I needed to have someone to kind of help guide me through this chapter for me to find it and figure it out, because I couldn't do it on my own. You can't overcome self with self, because self-reliance is what failed me. Self-will, anything that begins with self-reliance, self-will, it all failed me. Self failed self. And it's just because it's the ego back there that's driving everything that I wasn't even, I couldn't even see it. I wasn't even aware. It's this lack of power that was our dilemma. Lack of power over the ego. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? I'm going to give you the answer to that. And in my book, I just wrote after the question mark, and that's a question, so I highlighted in purple. After the question mark, I wrote page 55, because on page 55, we're not going to go there, but on 55, it tells you the how and the why. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. So somehow this power that we're going to find, right, enable you to find a power. So whatever kind of power I'm going to find, it's going to solve my problem, my drinking problem. Now, I have a question here. When you treat the problem, the symptoms go away. But if you only treat the symptoms, and this problem still exists. So we must solve the problem and get down to the root. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, we're going to talk about God. Now, from that moment all the way down to the bottom of the page is all highlighted in a warning. It's all written in pink. It's all highlighted in pink or red as a warning. And I wrote in the margin that it's my ego talking. So it says here, difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problem and explain our fellowship. But his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, for we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. You can see the ego in there, neatly evaded or entirely ignored, right? His face drops. We know how he feels. We have shared his honest, underline that word, honest doubt and prejudice. Man, that's huge. For me, share the honest doubt and prejudice. Make a list of your doubts and prejudice. Make a list. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. And I have, you know, it's because of the ego. So make a list. Do you have it? Make a list of your doubts and prejudice. And then I just wrote a question at the bottom of the page there, and I put, how do these doubts and prejudice manifest in ways in ways manifest in ways you think, feel, and act? Doubts and prejudice. How do these doubts and prejudice manifest in ways you think, feel, and act? Now I'm going to continue reading down page 45, and I want you to think about the ego as I'm reading. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. Can you see the ego in there? I hope everybody can see the ego in there talking. With that rejection, we imagine we abandoned the God idea entirely. Particular conception because it seemed inadequate as doubt, right? I'm trying to help you have, I just see myself in these experiences all over these pages. The more I really see my truth is being revealed to me. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak. Again, you see that coming from the ego, right? It's looking down, right? Somewhat weak, even cowardly. We look upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We looked askance at many individuals who claim to be godly. Can you see the ego in that paragraph? How the ego's just talking. The reason why I'm really pushing the whole ego thing is because once we get through step 4 and we get further on into steps 10, 11, and 12, that's what we really have to pay attention to. We got to keep an eye out for that ego. You see how it's going to subtly just get in there, Now we got a couple questions we need to highlight. How can a supreme being, we're going to underline the word supreme being, have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? And when I forgot, before we go any further, there's going to be about, I think it's 27 capitalized spiritual terms or concepts in this chapter. I didn't even know they were in here until my sponsor pointed it out. They're going to be all highlighted, so I'm going to point them out to you, and this will help you to, if you're struggling with a higher power, this will help you with those 27 and then there's also questions. So, again, a textbook, we started out slowly. Now we're looking for questions and we're looking for, keywords. So I'm going to go back here for a second and I'm going to go back to the page before on page 45. And it says, we had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. So we can underline a power greater than ourselves. That's going to be one of them. That's the first one, obviously. But where are we to find the power? Underline the word power. It's a capital P. I'm just going back and fixing it. I forgot to do it when we started. 2 lines down, you got a power greater than yourself. It's different. You got a power greater than ourselves and then a power greater than yourself. It's just worded different. I still highlighted. So there's 3 right there. You're going to go down about 4 lines and you're going to have the word God and you're going to highlight God or underline. So you should have power greater than ourselves, power greater than yourself, and God. Now we're going to try not to repeat anything. So if we see something that's already been repeated, we're not going to mark it. All right. Did I lose anybody? I'm okay now. I didn't lose. Everybody's good. All right. I just wanted to go back and fix that. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was the definition of the word conception, because that's what we're going to end up doing. We're going to end up coming up with our own conception. And I'd like to take all those different spiritual terms that we're going to find and kind of put them all together and come up with something, right? And create a conception. So conception is a way in which something is perceived or to help or arranged to form an idea. A way in which something is perceived, conception. And the word prejudiced is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. And I wrote for prejudice, I just wrote old ideas. I forgot to give you the definition of an atheist and agnostic. I'll give it to you again. An atheist doesn't believe in the existence of anything. That's an atheist. An agnostic isn't sure if there is a God. All right. I hope I can remember where it was. Okay, I'm back on page 46. And I wrote something on the top margin because it was the first time the word faith had come up so far in here. And faith means complete trust in something or somebody. Now, you can think about it like, I always like to look at this in faith, almost like a parent-child type of thing, where the child has lots of faith in the parent, to keep them safe and protected. So faith is complete trust in something or someone. So that could be similar to a higher power, but I think it could also, you got faith in a partner, in a relationship or something. It's complete trust in something or somebody. All right. And they talked about dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, but I also learned from the previous pages in the previous chapter, that self-reliance is just failing me and I'm just making a mess of my life. All right, so I'm going to pick up where I left off, and it was a promise. It says, yet in other moments we found ourselves thinking when enchanted by a starlit night. And we got a question. Who then made all this? I love doing that. I love going out at night, looking up at the stars and just asking myself and just being at awe and asking myself those questions and just kind of going down the rabbit hole for a while. You know what I mean? But sometimes I'll come out of that with some really great stuff and I got to go write it down, you know? Um, there was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. Yes, we agnostic temperament. I've had these thoughts and experiences. I underlined thoughts and experiences. I didn't think I was atheist or an agnostic. Wasn't sure what I was. But when I started relating to all these thoughts and experiences, it really helped me. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice, lay it aside, and express even a willingness to believe. That's all I got to do is express even a willingness to believe in a power. Now let's power greater than ourselves. We commenced to get results, even though it was impossible. I'm going to stop right there. It says to express even a willingness to believe. That's the starting point, just to have willingness to believe in a power. We commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power. Man, I underline fully defined or comprehend that power, which is God. I want to share a story. I shared it yesterday, but uh, when I first got sober, I struggled a lot with the whole God concept. Even though I had gone through the process, I just went through the process. I prayed when my sponsor told me to pray, and I would say, I don't believe in this, and I would do it anyway. You know what I mean? He'd say, just do it anyway. Fake it till you make it kind of thing. And I had experiences, but I was just, the ego was constantly telling me that it just wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough, you know? And so I'm 10 days sober. I get deployed to Kuwait. I'm in the military. I get deployed to Kuwait. Now I'm in the middle of a desert. And I'm there, you know, February 10th or something. February 12th is, 1997. I'm sober 10 days. And I am just, I am fighting with everybody and everything. I am just butting heads all the time, constantly. And I remember somebody saying at meetings, when else fails and you get desperate, man, just get on your knees and pray. So I walked out in the middle of the desert away from everyone, you know, and when I was all by myself, and I said, if there's anything out there, just show yourself. Just give me a sign. Anything. My ears, my eyes, I'm open. And the first time in my life, I was really desperate to see. I just needed something. I didn't even care if it was a camel spider or an ant. I just needed a sign. And so nothing happened that night. I did get on my knees and I prayed and I said, okay, and I didn't get a sign. And I thought, man, I am just screwed because doomed to an alcoholic death or live on spiritual basis. And I'm trying to, I feel like my journey's starting at this moment, you know? And so uh, something tells me I go out the next night and something tells me to look up. And when I looked up, the exact date was April 1st, 1997. And that was when the Hale Bob comet was the brightest. And that was my sign. It wasn't even a sign. That was like a big billboard, from God or whatever. That was a sign from me to stop trying to define or comprehend the power. Whatever it is, my higher power, I don't need to define it or even comprehend the power. That was the moment for me where I didn't have to give it a name. I didn't have to, none of that mattered. What mattered was that I finally accepted it in my heart that there was something because I saw a sign. I mean, I was a billboard. There was no doubt. I just accepted it in my heart that there was in my heart complete trust in something, complete trust in something that I can't define or comprehend. And there was this comet in the sky that was there for 18 months that was my higher power. You know what I mean? It wasn't like a light bulb that could go out and blow or a doorknob that can turn. This was it was a beautiful comet. I actually have pictures of it, but it changed my life. And the whole point of me sharing the story is you don't need to fully define or comprehend that power. You just got to accept it. Open your heart to that power, to become empowered by it. Become empowered by the power. You know what I mean? That I was so afraid to even go near. You know? You don't have to fully define or comprehend it. Just accept it. Much to our relief, we discovered need we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Guess what? This is the first time in my life that I've read something where it said, I don't need to consider your conception, because up to this point, me reading this for the first time, everybody has always told me how I'm supposed to believe and what I'm supposed to believe and how I'm supposed to worship and how I'm supposed to do this and this and this, Okay. But right here, it says, we discovered we didn't need to consider another's conception of God, our own conception, however inadequate. Now, I always like to think of the inadequate word is coming from the ego. The ego wants to say, I am just not good enough, straight up. It don't matter about what I'm doing, right? It says, however inadequate was sufficient to make the approach to effect a contact with him. Now, him, again, is God, you know? So I don't need to consider anybody else's conception. I can come up with my own. That's why I think it's amazing when Ebby came to Bill and said, just choose your own conception, Bill. If you got a problem with God, then just choose your own. So we got a couple of more. It says, soon as as soon as we admitted the possible existence of underlying creative intelligence. So I'm looking, as I'm going through this, spirit of the universe is another one we can believe in. So as I'm going through here, I'm looking for spiritual terms or spiritual conceptions that are going to be bigger, that I can believe in, that's going to be bigger than my ego. I do like, I don't know, I do like spirit of the universe. That sounds pretty big. Bigger, I need something bigger than my ego, man, because my ego is going to kill me. All right. It says, as soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, the spirit of the universe, underlying the totality of things, here's a promise. We began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction. I tell you what, that's quite the opposite of me feeling powerless, and I ain't got no direction. you know, provided we took other simple steps, and that's going to be the rest of the steps, 3 through 12. We got a promise here. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek him. To us, the realm of the spirit is another conception, so I underline that or highlight that. Is broad, rooming, all inclusive, never. There's that word never. Of course, I write that in the margin, never. Exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. To those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all. Well, it says men, but people. I'm assuming they will change that someday. All right, on to the next page. Man, there's some great promises in there. Almost that whole page I had, yet there is moments all the way down was almost the whole thing was promise. That's like 2 paragraphs. All right, we're on top of page 47. When therefore we speak to God, we mean your own conception of God. Now, I want you to think about this. We're in a meeting. Any Zoom meeting we go to is like worldwide. Am I right? At least the ones I go to are worldwide. And there's people in there from all over the world, When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception. That applies to everybody in the Zoom meeting. But I guarantee that your conception, someone's going to have a conception of God that's going to be different than others. That's why I really like this, because again, it talks about, in the 12 and 12 about step 2 is being a rallying point. We can all come together, and rally together. This applies to other spiritual expressions. So this is really important, okay? This applies to the other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Well, all those spiritual terms are what we're looking for, which we're going to find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms or conceptions deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. So that's why we're going through here and we're highlighting them or underlining them. We're underlining God, power greater than yourself, creative intelligence, spirit of the universe, realm of spirit. We're doing that. We're going through them all. And then when we're done, we need to go back and ask ourselves what they mean to us. And it says right here at the start, this was all they needed to commence spiritual growth. Wow, all I got to do is ask myself honestly what they mean to me, and I can start growing spiritually. That doesn't sound like a hard deal at all, man. That doesn't sound too bad. Now we got some promises to affect our first conscious relation with God as we understood him. So we're going to have a relation. We're going to have some sort of relation with God, right? A relation, a conscious relation. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. Think about it when you're growing, right? Things at first are going to be out of reach, but as you grow, you're going to be able to, reach them. That was growth. But if we wish to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. Again, you come up with your own conception. We need to ask ourselves, but one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe that there is a power greater than myself? Again, I highlighted that purple as a question. And I always like to think that I'm always willing. I always have the willingness. As soon as a man can say that he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. We got some more promises. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderful, effective spiritual structure can be built. Now, when I first read this, I thought that I was going to, me and my sponsor, we were going to go outside and we were going to like build a spiritual structure in my back, in my backyard. Like, I mean, that's what it said, spiritual structure. I'm like, this sounds kind of cool. Is it like one of those things I could work out with, where you climb up the ladder and then you kind of hang on a pole. What are we building here, right? Spiritual structure. And I remember talking to my sponsor about this, and I'm like, well, I don't really have room to build a spiritual structure in my yard, man. I really don't have much room to, and I can't do it in a driveway. And he goes, this is not something that you build outside yourself. This is something that you're going to build inside yourself with that power. Whatever your conception is, you're going to build, learn to have a relationship with this on the inside, and you're going to build a spiritual structure within yourself. Has to have solid foundation, and being willing to believe, or even just believing or having the willingness to believe, is the cornerstone. It's already the second stone. We're already starting to build it already. That was great news for us, for we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith, which seemed difficult to believe. I don't know, but I used to feel like that all the time. My ego was always talking. I wish I could believe like you, but I just can't accept all the stuff that you do. My ego was always talking to me. When people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, I wish I had what that man has? I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he does. He believes. But I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. I like to think sometimes that's my ego in there. And so, telling me these things, right? I'll tell you one thing I started to do to help kill off the ego. The one thing I started to do is when I sponsor people and they're into church, because it's not my conception. But if they ask me to go to church with them, I have an open mind because my ego is telling me, no, you don't want to do that. And so I always go with them. If anybody's ever asked me, I'll go with them because my ego wants to tell me, no, 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 no. So one way of fighting the ego is by going. That's just what I do. And it helps, it kind of helps keep me balanced and keeps that in check. So it was, so I'm going back to the page, bottom of the page 47. But I cannot accept surely the many articles of faith which are so plain to him. So it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level. See, that's what I want. I need something that's simple that I can just comprehend, and I could just start taking baby steps. Okay, I got to find those 27 capitalized spiritual terms in here, and then I'm going to ask myself what they all mean to me. I'm going to start to grow spiritually. Baby steps. I like it when it's simple. Besides a seemingly inability to accept much on faith, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. Can you see the ego all in that? The ego is just all abstinent, sensitiveness. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. Ego, big time. Now we got a direction. This sort of thinking had to be abandoned. Though some of us resisted, we found no great difficulty in casting aside such feelings. Faced with alcoholic destruction, now it's going back to that thing about the two alternatives. Faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon become as open-minded on spiritual matters as we tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. I'd like to think of finally beat us into a state of, that's that hopeless condition. I think the state of reasonableness, to be willing to go to any length and be, feeling that hopeless. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were. Ego. I just see prejudice and I think the ego, The reader may still ask why he should believe in a power greater than himself. We think there are good reasons. Let us have a look at some of them. The practical individual of today is a stickler for facts and results. Underline facts and underline results. Nevertheless, the 20th century readily accepts theories of all kinds, provided they are firmly grounded in fact. Underline fact. We have numerous theories. Theories, for example, about electricity. Everybody believes them without a murmur of doubt. Why this ready acceptance? It's the question I highlighted in purple. Simply because it is impossible to explain. Simply because it is impossible to explain what we see, feel, direct, and use without a reasonable assumption as a starting point. I like to think of this as it's simply because it is impossible to explain. I like to think of almost like when I'm feeling that presence, maybe, and it's impossible to explain what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling, what I'm directing, what I'm using, because it's that power, right? Can't fully define or comprehend it. Every day, everybody nowadays believes in scores of assumptions for which there is good evidence, but no personal visual proof. But no perfect, but no perfect visual proof. Question: and does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? It is being constantly revealed as mankind studies the material world that the outward appearances are not inward reality at all. You know, I highlighted that as a warning. Outward appearances are not outward appearances are not inward reality at all. My insides don't match my outsides. My insides don't match my outsides. And I'm gonna show you that again when we get into step 4. I could show you lots of things like that where my insides don't match my outsides, you know? And the idea is to have balance, to have them both matching. My inside matches the outside. Most of my life, my inside never matched the outside. You know, if the outside's chaotic, the inside's chaotic. You know, the prosaic steel girder is a mass of electronics whirling around each other at incredible speed. These tiny bodies are governed by precise laws, and these laws hold true throughout the material world. Science tells us so. We have no reason to doubt it. I underlined the word doubt it. When, however, when, however, the perfectly logical assumption is to suggest that underneath the material world and life as we see it, there is underline, it's another spiritual term here, all powerful. You know what, dude? I think that might be the one that I'm gonna pick over my ego. You know, I'm finding one here. Guiding, and we already have creative intelligence, I think, from the second page. And then we're going to have the ego talking. We got some warnings in here. It says right there, our perverse streak comes to a surface, and we laboriously set out to convince ourselves it isn't so. We read worldly books and indulge in wily arguments, thinking we believe this universe needs no God to explain it. See, the ego. Where our contention's true, it would follow that life originated out of nothing, means nothing, and proceeds nowhere. What do they call that? The nothingness. Instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearhead of God's ever advancing creation. I underlined creation as something to believe in. It's capitalized. We agnostics and atheists chose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end of all. Can you see ego in there? Everybody see the ego in there talking? It's the end, man. It's basically saying my word. You know, my human intelligence was the last word. You know, again, I'm pointing out where the ego's talking, so you can start to become aware and start to becoming aware of your thinking and starting to become aware when the ego is working in your life. You know, because it's just subtle. It's like alcohol. It's cunning, baffling, and powerful. You know. All right. At the beginning of the end, rather vain of us, wasn't it? Again, that was a question. I highlighted that purple. We who have traveled this dubious path beg you, and now they're begging me to lay aside prejudice, old ideas, even against organized religion. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to. That's the first time actually that it did mention the word religion in there. Okay. But it's just telling me to have an open mind. And like I shared that experience with people that, with sponsors and say, hey man, I'm going to church, can you come with me? Because they want to share the experience with me. It's not that I want to share it with them, but they want to share it with me. So I go, I go and do that. And I keep an open mind, because I walk away with something. I can get something from just about anything. It says, we have learned that whatever the human frailties of various faiths may be, we got a promise. Those faiths have given purpose and directions to millions. People of faith have a logical idea of what life is all about. Actually, we used to have no reasonable conception whatever. And then we got the ego. We used to amuse ourselves by cynically dissecting spiritual beliefs and practices. I used to do that a lot when I was younger, dissecting them. Then we got a direction. When we might have observed that many spiritually minded persons of all races, colors, and creeds, a promise, were demonstrating a degree of stability, happiness, usefulness, which we should have sought out ourselves. You know, this is what I'm experiencing today with emotional sobriety, stability, happiness, and usefulness. I'm just sharing it with you. When you get into when you get to a certain place where you're sponsoring people and you start living in emotional sobriety, these things just start to happen. Stability, happiness, usefulness. Age 50. Instead, again, we got the ego talking. Instead, we looked at the human defects of these people and sometimes used your shortcomings as a basis of wholesome condemnation. We talked of intolerance while we were intolerant ourselves. We missed the reality and the beauty of the forest because we were diverted by the ugliness of some of the trees. We never, there's that word never, gave the spiritual side of life a fair hearing. And I'm going to tell you, I didn't until I came to AA. And even when I first came to AA, I was like, no, 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 not that. I never gave it a fair hearing. And once I finally did, things started to happen. In our personal stories, we will find a wide variation in a way in which the teller approaches and conceives of a power which is greater than himself. Whether we agree with the particular approach. Now, I always look at this when I'm listening to people that are sharing, and you go to a speaker meeting and someone's sharing, and it's just whether you agree with particular approach or conception seems to make little difference. Experience has taught us that these are matters about which, for our purpose, we need not be worried. They are questions. Oh, I love that question. I circle that. Questions for each individual to settle for himself. I like to think that, I just like to think that it doesn't even matter anymore. Only thing that matters is what I believe in, and then it works for me, you know. And then especially when I'm working with somebody else, that they find something to believe in, something. On one proposition, however, these men and women are strikingly agree. Every one of them has gained access to. We're talking about gaining access to a power, and believes in the power greater than himself. This power, you see, it's capital P, right? This power has in each case accomplished the miraculous, the humanly impossible. As a celebrated American statesman put it, let's look at the record. We're talking about a power. We're talking about gaining access to the power. You may have had certain spiritual beliefs before, but have you ever had access to the power and become empowered by it? Here are thousands of men and women, worldly and indeed. They flatly declare that since they have come to believe in a power greater than themselves, to take a certain simple attitude toward the power. I got to take a certain simple attitude toward this power and to do certain simple things. And we got to promise. There has been a revolutionary change in our way of living, which is acting, and our way of in thinking. A revolutionary change in the way we're living and thinking. We got a warning. In the face of collapse and despair, in the face of total failure of human resources, that's my self-reliance completely failed me. I want you to get to that place and really feel that self-reliance is just total failure of human resources. That's the second time I talked about total failure, failure. I think it was on 45, you know. They failed us utterly, is what it said, you know, and that total failure of human resources. And then we got some promises that they found that a new peace, I mean, a new power, peace, happiness, and sense of direction flowed into them. This happened soon after they wholeheartedly met a few simple requirements. Those requirements are going to start in step 3. Few simple requirements. Once confused and baffled by the seemingly futility of existence, again, that's the ego, they show the underlying reasons why they were making heavy going of life. Leaving aside the drink problem question, or even aside the drink question, they tell why living was so unsatisfactory. I also put over there why living was so unmanageable and out of control. And we got some promises in here. They show how the change came over them. So that's what I'm going to do when I'm sharing at a meeting. I'm going to share about the change, right? The change that came over. When many hundreds of people are able to say that the consciousness of we're going to underline the presence of God as something else to believe in, is today the most powerful fact, underline the word fact, of their lives. They present a powerful reason why one should have faith. Now, I get from reading this why one should have faith. I just want to know how to obtain faith. How do I get to that point where I can give complete trust, right? This world of ours has made more material progress in the last century than in all the millenniums which went before. Almost everyone knows the reason. Students of ancient history tell us that the intellect of men in those days was equal to the best of today. Yet in ancient times, material progress was painfully slow. The spirit of modern scientific inquiry, research, and invention was almost unknown. In the realm of the material, men's minds were fettered by superstition, tradition, and all sorts of fixed ideas. You know, I can even go old ideas. Some of the contemporaries of Columbus thought a round earth preposterous. Others came near putting Galileo to death for his astronomical theories. Theses. We ask ourselves this. We got a question. Are not some of us just as biased and unreasonable about the realm of the spirit as were the ancients about the realm of the material? Question mark. Even in the present century, American newspapers were afraid to print an account of the Wright brothers' first successful flight of Kitty Hawk. We got a whole bunch of questions in here. Had not all efforts at flight failed before? Yes. Did not Professor Langley's flying machine go to the bottom of the Potomac River? Yes. I'm going to tell you the Potomac River is right near Washington, D.C. by the Capitol, if anybody wanted to know where that was. Was it not true that the best mathematical minds had proved men could never fly? Yup. Had not people said God had reserved this privilege to the birds? But yet, only 30 years later, the conquest of air was almost an old story, and airplane travel was in full swing. 30 years later, from Kitty Hawk, from the Wright brothers' first flight, 30 years later, we're out flying all over the place, right? The reason why I'm mentioning it is because, but in most fields of our generation has witnessed complete liberation of our thinking. I underline complete liberation of our thinking. Freedom. Show any longshoreman a Sunday supplement describing a proposal to explore the moon by means of a rocket, and he will say, I bet they'll do it, and maybe not so long either. Now, he's talking about flying to the moon now. But this book was written before we went to the moon. This book was written in 1939. And guess what? You know when we went to the moon? 30 years later. And Bill was already writing about it. And he already said 30 years later about flying. And now, 30 years later, we went to the moon after the book was written. I thought that was kind of odd how we kind of foresaw that. Now we got a couple questions. Is not our age characterized by the ease with which we discard old ideas for new, by the complete readiness with which we throw away the theory or gadget which does not work for something new which does. I like to think of throwing away as letting go. Old ideas is like prejudice. But I got to learn to let go of old ideas, which is doubts and prejudice. We had to ask ourselves why we shouldn't apply to our human problems the same readiness to change our point of view. Now, this is page 52, and I'm going to read the bedevilments. I know yesterday I kind of went right over there to wrap up step 1, but this is where our unmanageability all comes from. The unmanageability of our alcoholism from being powerless, and not only that, but I can feel these things before and after I'm drinking. I can feel these things before, and I usually use this a lot to look at, always revisit it quite a lot, maybe even daily, just to see where I'm at with all this, because if I'm spiritually fit, that's the whole point, is to learn to be spiritually fit. I won't be having these type of problems. So it says, the first one says, we were having troubles with personal relationships. I'm going to have all kinds of problems. 2, we couldn't control our emotional nature. Emotions up and down, like a roller coaster. 3, we were a prey of misery and depression. 4, we couldn't make a living. That affects our pocketbook. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be a real help to other people. That goes along with feeling useless. And you see, to me, that's the bedevilments, the 8 bedevilments, and they all affect me on the inside, my internal condition. Because if I'm spiritually fit, I'm just not going to have problems with personal relationships. And my emotional nature is going to be balanced. I'm not going to be a prey of misery and depression. And I'm going to either make a living that I'm satisfied with, or I'm going to retire. I don't feel useless. I feel useful, and I'm not driven by fear anymore. And for the most part, I'm happy. Was not a basic solution of these bedevilments more important than whether we see newsreels of a lunar flight? And that was a question, so I highlighted it purple. And that says, of course it was. When we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe. So we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon a universe. We had to start doubting. There's that doubt. I got to start doubting the power of God. Our ideas did not work, but the God idea did. So I got to switch from being self-reliant to a simple reliance. The Wright brothers' almost foolish faith that they could build a flying machine which could fly was the mainspring of their accomplishment. Without that, nothing could have happened. We agnostic and atheists were sticking to the idea that self-sufficiency or self-reliance would solve our problems. See, I just think that's all the ego in there. When others showed us that God sufficiency or God reliance worked with them, we began to feel like those who had insisted the Wright brothers would never fly. That's the ego. Logic is great stuff. We like it. We still like it. It is not by chance that we were given the power to reason, to examine the evidence of our senses, and to draw a conclusion. And that's really what we do with the first 2 steps, is we draw a conclusion. That is one of the man's magnificent attributes. We agnostically inclined would not feel satisfied with the proposal which does not lend itself to a reasonable approach and interpretation. Hence, we are at pains to tell why we think our present faith is reasonable, why we think it more sane and logical to believe than not to believe, why we say our former thinking was soft and mushy when we threw up our hands in doubt and said we don't know. When we become alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposing self-imposing crisis. Man, I created this. We could not postpone or evade. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What is your choice to be? Again, I highlighted that last one, the question in purple. Arrived at this point, we were squarely confronted with the question of faith. We couldn't duck the issue. Some of us had already walked far from bridge of reason is something else we can believe in, another conception, toward a desire short of faith. The outlines and the promise of the underlying new land had brought luster to tired eyes and fresh courage to flagging spirits. Friendly hands had stretched out in welcome. We were grateful that reason, and reason is capitalized, so it's something else that you can believe in, had brought us so far. But somehow we couldn't quite step ashore. Perhaps we had been leaning too heavily on reason that last mile, and we did not like to lose our support. That was natural. But let us think a little bit more closely. Without knowing it, had we not been brought to where we stood by a certain kind of faith? It's a question mark. I highlighted it in purple, but it's a great question for you to think about. Without knowing it, had we not been brought to where we stood by a certain kind of faith? You know, when I sit and think about these questions, I think of faith. When did I first develop faith? I first developed some kind of faith when I went to a meeting. When I went to my first meeting and I felt welcome, I started to have faith in the meeting. I started to have faith and I started to witness those miracles happening. You know, all those promises we had read. I've seen those happen. Without knowing it, had I not been living to where we stood by a certain kind of faith. It's like faith had brought me all the way to this point already. 4, did we not believe in our own reasoning? Did we not have confidence in our own ability to think? What was this but a short of faith? Yes, we had been faithful, objectionably faithful to the God of reason. You can underline God of reason. So in one way or another, we discovered that faith had been involved all the time. We found, too, that we had been worshippers. What a state of mental goose flesh that used to bring on. We're talking about worshiping of other things, all right? We got a whole bunch of questions in here. Had we not variously worshiped people? You know, I just wrote like above people, I put spouse, you know, maybe even parents. You know, I worship my dad and my mom, you know. And then it says sentiment. I like to think of sentiment, then it's got things. The biggest one on there is money. Money, worship money. Oh yeah, with no money, world stops, right? So I worship money, and then ourselves. And I put the ego over there, right? Ego for ourselves, right? And I didn't even know it when I was doing this stuff. I didn't even know I was worshiping money or worshiping, you know, other people. And then, with a better motive, had we not worshipfully beheld the sunset, the sea, a flower? Who of us had not loved something or somebody? I underline the word loved. Who of us have not loved something or somebody? How much did these feelings, these loves, these worships have to do with pure reason? Little or nothing. We saw it last. Were not these things the tissue out of which our lives were constructed? Yeah. I just felt like everything was all about my feelings and everything was all about me. Did not these feelings, after all, determine the course of our existence? It was impossible to say we had no capacity for faith or love. I underline the word love or worship. In one form or another, we had been living by faith and little else. Imagine life without faith, with nothing left but pure reason. It wouldn't be life. But we believe in life. Of course we did. We could not prove life in the sense that you can prove a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Yet there it is. There it was. Question. Could we still say the whole thing was nothing but a mass of electrons created out of nothing, meaning nothing, whirling on to the destiny of nothingness? I'm not even sure how to answer that. Of course we couldn't. The electrons themselves seem more intelligent than that. At least, so the chemist said. Hence, we saw that that reason isn't everything. Neither is reason, as most of us use it, entirely dependable. though it emanated from our best minds. What about people who proved that man could never fly? We have been seeing another kind of flight. I underline this spiritual liberation. Man, you ever hear that for a topic at a meeting? The spiritual freedom from this world. People who rose above their problems. They said God made these things possible, and we only smiled. We had seen spiritual release, but like to tell ourselves it wasn't true. Ego, right? Isn't that the ego? You see it and you're going, it's not true. No, that's bull. That's bull, right? Actually, we were fooling ourselves. For deep down, so this is where you got to find this power. For deep down, in every man, woman, and child is a fundamental idea of God. Now, it may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things that were on page 54. But in some form or another, it is there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves, the miraculous demonstration of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. We finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup, just, now I underline this, just as much as a feeling we had for a friend. And I just wrote love. Sometimes we have to search fearlessly, but he was there. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality. I underlined the great reality, something to believe in, deep down within us. And the last analysis is only there that he may be found. It was so with us. We can only clear the ground a bit if our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enables you to think honestly. So you're going to think honestly, encourage you to search diligently within yourself. Then, if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. And a broad highway is something else that you can believe in. With this attitude, the attitude of, with this attitude, you cannot fail. The attitude of, and you thinking honestly and encouraging you to search diligently within yourself. You cannot fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. In this book, you read the experience of a man who thought he was an atheist. His story is so interesting that some of it should be told now. His change of heart was dramatic, convincing, and moving. Our friend was a minister's son. He attended church school where he became rebellious at what he thought was an overdose of religious education. For many years thereafter, he was dogged by trouble and frustration, business failure, insanity, fatal illness, and suicide. These calamities in his immediate family embittered and depressed him. Post-war disillusionment, even more serious alcoholism, impending mental and physical collapse brought him to the point of self-destruction. Now, does that sound like self-reliance there? One night, when confined to a hospital, he was approached by an alcoholic who had known his spiritual experience. Our friend's gorge rose as he bitterly cried out, "If there is a God, he certainly hasn't done anything for me." But later, alone in the room, he asked himself this question: is it possible that all the religious people I have known were wrong? While pondering the answer, he felt as though he had lived in hell. Then, like a thunderbolt, a great thought came, and it crowded out all else. Who are you to say there is no God? This man recounts that he tumbled out of bed to his knees. In a few seconds, he was overwhelmed by the conviction of the presence of God. He felt that presence. It poured over and through him with the certainty and majesty of a great tide of at flood. The barriers he had built through the years were swept away. He stood in the presence, this is something else you can believe in, the presence of infinite power and love. Again, I underline what love because it's capitalized. He had stepped from bridge to shore. For the first time, he lived in conscious companionship with his creator. Companionship. That's what we're looking to have, some kind of companionship with this power. Thus was our friend's cornerstone fixed in place. No later vicissitude has shaken it. His alcoholic problem, the obsession of the mind, was taken away. That very night, years ago, it disappeared. Just like in step 10, it says the problem has been removed. Safe for a brief few moments of temptation, the thought of drink has never returned. Never. And at such times, a great revulsion has risen up in him. Seemingly, he could not drink even if he could. God had restored his sanity. He couldn't drink even if he would, because the obsession has been removed. There's no more desire. What is this but a miracle of healing? Again, that was a question. Yet, its elements are simple. Circumstances made him willing to believe. Circumstances. He humbly offered himself to his maker, and then he knew. Circumstances. I'd like to think of this as it's a realization for me of my truth in step 1. It's the circumstances. It's the realization of my truth in step 1. And that's, when I'm in that, my realization for me in step 1 is the hopeless state of my mind, a hopeless state of being. Remember, we really touched upon that hopeless, right? So my realization is the truth in step 1 about that hopelessness. And, the circumstances that bring me to step 2, the circumstances that bring me here is that I was hopeless. And I'm been given hope, Again, the hope that I'm giving is that I'm going to I can get my own conception of God, and I can find something to believe in, I don't want to be in that hopeless state anymore. Not that I haven't been in there in a long time, the hopeless state of mind, but I'm so grateful that I'm not there. And that's where I really kind of, circumstances made him willing to believe. He humbly offered himself to his maker, and the maker is another one you can believe. Even so, has God restored us all to right minds? To this man, the revelation was sudden. Some of us grow into it more slowly, but he has come to all who honestly sought him. When we draw near to him, he disclosed himself to us. All right, give me 1 second here. So you're going to formulate a concept of God who could be, this is what I was thinking of this. I formed a conception someday, like, remember I was talking about, I had a lot of religion pushed on me as I was a child. So, but I formed some kind of conception in my head at that time. And I believe that this God, whatever the concept I had at the time, that I could rely on this God at certain times, but who at other times was not there for me. And I felt like times it was punishing me. You see how the ego's in there, and so the ego was already there. Can you realize that God, as you understand God or don't understand God, is really just a concept that you created? Remember I said I created all this all by myself? Well, now I can create this thing with God, and I don't have to necessarily be the creator anymore, and I can form this. I don't have to be the creator, because it's in, the next step that we're going to get to, it says we stop playing God, in order for you to know and to experience God, I want you, you're going to have to create it. In order for you to experience it, you're going to have to create a conception. Come up with the conception of God that you would want to know personally, a power that you could be comfortable around right now. Tell me what that power would be like, Well, I can tell you that power that would be loving and forgiving. And that power would give wise guidance and protection. All you have to do now is start experiencing that concept. Whatever concept you decide to believe in, you can go and experience it. The new concept that you have created to replace the old concept that you created will manifest itself. So I created an old concept that didn't work for me, and now I can create a new one that does. But it still has to be bigger than my ego. Upon this simple cornerstone, you can then begin to affect conscious contact with God of your own understanding. First, it's about the willingness to believe in a power greater than yourself. Next, it's about coming up with the conception of God that is comfortable to you And finally, it's about making a choice about that power. And here is the choice. You are faced with self-imposed crisis, which has resulted in a lack of power, insanity, and hopelessness. So are you willing to make this choice that the God of your understanding is everything in your life? The next thing to understand is that the only place that you will come to know and experience God is deep down within yourself, not outside yourself. You are blocked from knowing that which sustains you because of your self-will or your ego. You have been playing God in all areas of your life. Why would you seek power if you think you are the power? If you're willing to give up that belief system and you're willing to search fearlessly within yourself, the God of your conception you just came up with will be revealed. Are you willing to seek that power through this course of action? I got a couple of questions right before I end here for really to make you think about before I end this. It's 4 questions I came up with to really, I like to come up with questions at the end because not everybody I sponsor are brand new. Some people I sponsor have years of sobriety and they want a new experience, a deeper experience. So I always throw out these questions at the end, and I'm going to do that from now all the way for the rest of the workshop. There's always going to be questions at the end that I'm just going to put out. You can write them down. If you missed anything, just hit me up and I'll be glad to send you messages on whatever it was that you missed. So the first question is, how well do you do on your own power? How well do you do on your own power? I don't do very good on my own power, right? The second one, are you relying on yourself exclusively? Self-reliance. 3, what areas of your life are you living as if you don't need power other than your own? Again, what areas of your life are you living as if you don't need power other than your own? And the last question, what areas of your life are you living as if you control the power of God? As if you control the power of God. Again, I want to thank everyone for being here and helping me stay sober another day. Let's have a moment of silence. Remind us of the still sick and suffering alcoholic. And let's start that right now. Okay, I'm going to welcome everyone back. And I think that after we go into this chapter, I think it's appropriate to close this workshop with the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And we'll see everybody next week for step 3. And I'm just going to stop the recording right now.